Have you ever found yourself caught in the maddening paradox of someone who seems to have chosen you as their person, yet simultaneously keeps you at arm's length like a beautiful painting they're afraid to touch? This peculiar dance of devotion and distance reveals itself most clearly in how avoidants decide you're the one, but still push you away, creating a psychological labyrinth that would confound even the most astute observers of human nature. The avoidant heart operates under a fascinating contradiction. Picture, if you will, a master art collector who has spent years searching for the perfect piece. When they finally discover it, their instinct isn't to display it prominently where everyone can see and potentially damage it. Instead, they lock it away in the most secure vault, visiting it only when conditions are absolutely perfect. This is precisely how the avoidant mind approaches love when it encounters someone truly special. What makes this phenomenon particularly intriguing is the role of what psychologists call the halo effect in their selection process. When an avoidant person identifies you as the one, they don't arrive at this conclusion through the typical romantic progression of gradual attachment. Rather, they experience an almost instantaneous recognition, as if you possess some ineffable quality that bypasses their usual emotional fortifications. You become bathed in this psychological halo where your positive attributes become magnified and generalized across every aspect of your being. Yet here lies the cruel irony. The very qualities that earn you this elevated status also trigger their deepest fears about vulnerability and loss of autonomy. The closer you come to mattering, the more dangerous you become to their carefully constructed emotional architecture. It's as if they've discovered fire, simultaneously mesmerized by its warmth and terrified of being consumed by its flames. This internal battle manifests as what attachment theorists term approach avoidance conflict. Imagine standing before two magnets of equal strength, one pulling you forward with irresistible force, the other repelling you with identical intensity. The avoidant experiences this constantly when they've identified their person. Every instinct screams at them to move closer, to surrender to the connection, while an equally powerful force demands they maintain distance to preserve their sense of self. Understanding this dynamic becomes crucial for anyone who finds themselves in the crosshairs of avoidant affection. The pushing away isn't evidence of diminished feelings, quite the opposite. It's often the clearest indicator that their feelings have grown so intense they've triggered every psychological defense mechanism in their arsenal. The tragedy is that most people interpret this distance as rejection, never realizing they're witnessing the avoidant's clumsy attempt at self-preservation in the face of overwhelming emotional significance. Throughout this exploration, we'll uncover the subtle signs that indicate when an avoidant has mentally designated you as their chosen one, despite their contradictory behavior. We'll examine the psychological mechanisms that drive this maddening push-pull dynamic and, most importantly, provide you with the tools to navigate these treacherous emotional waters without losing yourself in the process. Because understanding the avoidant heart isn't just about decoding their behavior, it's about protecting your own emotional well-being while remaining open to the possibility of genuine connection. Consider the tale of a brilliant architect who had spent her entire career designing magnificent buildings from a distance, never once setting foot inside any of her completed structures. She'd pour her soul into every blueprint, obsess over every detail, yet the moment construction finished, she'd move on to the next project, viewing her creations only from across the street. Her colleagues found this behavior eccentric but harmless, until she designed what everyone agreed was her masterpiece, a stunning residential complex that seemed to capture something indefinable about home itself. For months after its completion, she followed her usual pattern, admiring the building only from afar. But something was different this time. She found herself returning to that same street corner every evening, drawn by an inexplicable need to witness how the light played across the windows at sunset. The building had awakened something in her that no previous project had touched. Yet the thought of actually entering it filled her with an anxiety she couldn't name. One rainy evening, she noticed a young woman standing in one of the illuminated windows on the third floor. Something about the scene, the warm glow, the sense of life being lived within the walls she'd conceived, stirred a longing so profound it nearly brought her to tears. She realized, standing there in the downpour, that all her professional detachment hadn't been wisdom at all, but fear. Fear of discovering that her creations might not live up to her dreams, or worse, that they might exceed them entirely, forcing her to confront how much of herself she'd poured into each structure. The architect represents the avoidant who has identified their person. The building symbolizes the relationship they've mentally constructed with you, perfect in their imagination, loaded with meaning they've never experienced before, yet terrifying to actually inhabit. Like Penn Badgley's Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You, they observe from a distance, convinced they understand you completely, while simultaneously avoiding the vulnerability that comes with genuine intimacy. The woman in the window becomes the embodiment of everything they desire, yet fear to claim. She represents the life they could have if only they could overcome their terror of disappointment or, paradoxically, of getting exactly what they've always wanted. The architect's evening vigils mirror how avoidants orbit around their chosen person, close enough to feel the warmth, far enough away to maintain the illusion of safety. As our story unfolds, we discover that the architect eventually learned the woman in the window was actually an interior designer who had specifically requested that apartment because she'd fallen in love with the building's unique architectural vision. She'd been hoping to meet the architect, to collaborate on future projects, never knowing that the building's creator stood vigil outside every evening. The supreme irony, two people drawn to each other through the medium of the very space that was meant to bring them together, yet separated by glass, distance, and the architect's inability to cross the threshold of her own creation. The resolution came only when a storm knocked out the power throughout the neighborhood. The architect, seeing the building dark for the first time since its completion, felt a panic she couldn't explain. She found herself running through the rain, using her keys to enter the building she'd avoided for months, climbing 3 flights of stairs in darkness to knock on the door of apartment 3B. When the woman answered by candlelight, the architect found herself speechless, able only to stammer that she'd wanted to make sure everyone was safe. But the interior designer recognized something in the architect's face, perhaps the same passionate attention to detail she'd admired in the building's design, or maybe simply the vulnerability of someone who had finally found the courage to enter their own masterpiece. The two spent that storm-darkened night talking by candlelight about the relationship between creators and their creations, about the courage required to inhabit the spaces we design for ourselves, about the difference between admiring something from afar and actually living within it. Now, let's translate this story into practical wisdom for your own situation. When an avoidant has decided you're the one, their behavior will likely seem contradictory at first glance. They'll demonstrate an almost uncanny knowledge of your preferences, remembering details about conversations you barely recall having, much like how Chuck Bass from Gossip Girl could recall every seemingly insignificant detail about Blair Waldorf despite his emotional unavailability. Yet they'll simultaneously maintain peculiar boundaries that seem designed to keep you at a specific distance, close enough to study, far enough away to avoid real vulnerability. The first crucial understanding is recognizing that their push-pull behavior isn't random or cruel, but rather a highly organized psychological defense system responding to unprecedented threat levels. When they push you away, they're not rejecting you. They're trying to regulate their own nervous system, which has gone into overdrive precisely because you matter so much. Think of it as emotional circuit breakers triggering to prevent what they perceive as catastrophic system failure. Your response during these moments of distance becomes absolutely critical. The natural instinct is to pursue, to demand explanations, to interpret their withdrawal as evidence of diminishing feelings. This approach invariably backfires because it confirms their subconscious belief that intimate connection inevitably leads to loss of autonomy. Instead, develop what might be called confident patience, a stance that acknowledges their need for space while maintaining your own emotional equilibrium. This doesn't mean becoming a doormat or accepting poor treatment. Rather, it means understanding that their capacity for closeness operates on a different rhythm than yours. When they pull back, resist the urge to chase. Instead, use that time to invest in your own interests, relationships, and personal growth. This serves two purposes. It prevents you from becoming consumed by their emotional weather patterns, and it demonstrates that you're not dependent on their constant attention for your own well-being. The approach avoidance conflict they experience is like being caught between two equally powerful forces. Your role isn't to eliminate this tension. That's impossible and would likely drive them away entirely. Instead, your goal is to become a consistent, non-threatening presence in their emotional landscape. This means being predictable in your responses, avoiding dramatic reactions to their distancing behaviors, and maintaining your own sense of self, regardless of their proximity or withdrawal. When they do move closer, and they will in fits and starts, resist the temptation to immediately capitalize on the opening by pushing for greater commitment or more vulnerability than they're ready to offer. Instead, match their energy level, allowing them to set the pace of intimacy while ensuring your own needs aren't completely sacrificed in the process. This requires developing an almost supernatural level of emotional intelligence and self-regulation. Consider establishing what might be called emotional anchoring, consistent behaviors and responses that help them feel safe over time. This might mean always responding to their communications within a reasonable time frame without seeming over-eager, maintaining your own social life and interests regardless of their availability, or simply being someone they can predict and rely upon without feeling suffocated. The halo effect that initially drew them to you can become both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it means they've elevated you above most other people in their mental hierarchy. On the other hand, it creates impossible standards that no human being could consistently meet. When reality inevitably clashes with their idealized vision, and it will, your response will determine whether this becomes a relationship-ending crisis or an opportunity for deeper, more authentic connection. During these moments of disillusionment, avoid the trap of trying to restore yourself to their pedestal through exceptional efforts or dramatic gestures. Instead, embrace your own humanity openly and without apology. Show them that being real doesn't mean being disappointing, and that genuine intimacy actually requires the courage to be imperfect together. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of loving an avoidant, teaching them through example that love doesn't require perfection, just presence. The journey of loving someone who has chosen you yet continues to push you away requires a level of emotional sophistication that would challenge even the most secure individuals. Like Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris, navigating the complex cultural landscape of French romance, you must learn to read subtle signals, respect unspoken boundaries, and maintain your own identity while adapting to an entirely different set of relationship rules. Remember that their selection of you as the one wasn't arbitrary or casual. Something about your essence spoke to their deepest longings while simultaneously feeling safe enough to approach, even if that approach remains tentative and irregular. Your task isn't to cure their avoidance. That's work only they can do. but rather to create conditions where genuine intimacy becomes possible without triggering their fundamental fears about loss of self. This means developing your own secure attachment responses regardless of their insecure patterns. It means learning to find fulfillment and meaning in your life independent of their emotional availability, while remaining open to connection when they're ready to offer it. Most importantly, it means recognizing when their push-pull dynamic has crossed the line from understandable self-protection into harmful behavior that you shouldn't tolerate. The avoidant heart that has chosen you is capable of profound love, but it expresses that love in a language many people never learn to speak fluently. Your willingness to understand this language without losing yourself in translation determines whether this connection becomes a source of mutual growth or mutual frustration. The choice, ultimately, belongs to both of you. They must choose vulnerability over self-protection, while you must choose patience over pursuit, understanding over ultimatums. The path forward requires courage from both parties, their courage to risk the vulnerability they've spent a lifetime avoiding, and your courage to love someone whose primary expression of caring often looks remarkably like pushing you away. Yet for those willing to undertake this challenging journey, the rewards can be extraordinary. An avoidant who has genuinely chosen you and learned to inhabit that choice offers a depth of loyalty and appreciation that few other attachment styles can match. Remember that transformation happens slowly, through countless small moments of safety and connection rather than grand gestures or dramatic breakthroughs. Your consistent presence, emotional stability, and refusal to abandon ship during their inevitable storms creates the foundation upon which genuine intimacy can eventually be built. The question isn't whether they'll continue to push you away. They will, at least initially. The question is whether you have the wisdom and strength to stay the course while maintaining your own emotional well-being, creating space for love to grow in its own unique and sometimes maddening way.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.